Yo, what is going on, guys? Serious here. Today's video, we're going to be talking about cheating in Call of Duty. Now, we're not going to be doing like a history of cheating in Call of Duty. That's a totally different video that I'm going to do at some point. We're just going to be talking about the modern cheating issues in Call of Duty. And this video is basically just going to be another one of those long format videos because apparently people like that. So, if you're like playing a game or doing something and you just want to throw this in the background, that's probably the best. Or if you want to watch the background gameplay, there's some ZBR going on. So, hope you guys enjoy the video, and we're going to go ahead and get into it. So to get this video started, I'm going to really briefly talk about my background. Now, this is because in contrast to what you're probably used to, I am actually a cheat developer. I've been doing this for 9 years, roughly. I develop games, I work with anti-cheat stuff all the time. The community that I deal with is a bunch of cheaters. I know some of the people making the biggest cheats in the Call of Duty community, and basically, this is just to say that this is in contrast to what you're probably used to, where you're hearing career YouTubers or gamers talking about the cheating situation, and most of the information that they talk about is either very vague or misinformation because they're not informed on what's actually going on behind the scenes. They're doing their best with what they've got, but a lot of the time they don't have the knowledge. So the point of this video is for me as an actual cheat developer to be able to tell you guys like what's actually going on behind the scenes in terms of Call of Duty. Now, of course, I can't give you information about what's happening at the studios because obviously I don't work at the studios, but I do have a lot of information about the changes that have been happening to the anti-cheat because we work with the anti-cheat all the time. And to be clear, we work against the anti-cheat, but we have to know what is going on with the anti-cheat to be able to make our cheats. So our knowledge on it is pretty strong, and we have a lot of information about what the developers are doing to try to catch cheaters. Now, cheating in general across multiplayer first-person shooters is pretty common, but there's different levels of capability that cheaters have in different games. You'll notice that in some games they can do crazy things like change the damage of their gun, or teleport, or fly cars like in Warzone, or do any of these weird things that some other games you can't do anything even remotely close to that. Like, for example, in Valorant, the most you're going to see somebody cheating is probably aimbot, anti-aim, ESP, and we'll talk about what all that means in a minute. But basically, the capabilities are very different based off of the game engine that's being used. It's not just the game engine. A lot of the time, it depends on the specific game because the game has to be engineered to specifically deal with cheating out of the bat. And that's kind of the biggest problem in the entire industry right now is that the majority of modern shooters are franchises that have been around for 10, 15 years, and they are running from behind. Their games were built from the foundation on a player-to-player model. What this means is that one player hosts the game, and all the other players connect to that player and trust the host with all the information. The host basically controls everything. If the host wants to say that you jump higher, now you jump higher. If the host wants to say that you have 1 health, you have 1 health. And there's nothing that you can do about it as a client. That security model is inherently flawed because what if the host is cheating? Well, then the host can do whatever they want. And so a lot of these games have switched to dedicated server models, but unfortunately, their code is still from a code base that was designed around player-to-player interactions. And for something like Call of Duty, there are a lot of places in the game where the engineers just inherently assume that all the players are the same level of trust. And you've got weird stuff like what can happen with the vehicles in Warzone, where basically a player can do some trickery in their client-side code and, fly a car around, which is ridiculous. That should never happen. But the point is that modern games are almost always running from behind, and cheaters are inherently advantaged because it's so much easier to cheat than it is to stop cheaters. The way most modern developers address this issue is with client-side anti-cheat. What this means is that when you're playing the game, there is code running inside the game that is actively checking to see if you're doing anything suspicious. Unfortunately, cheaters can also run code in the game, and they can basically fight back directly against the anti-cheat. They can disable parts of the anti-cheat. They can hide from parts of the anti-cheat. They can reverse engineer the anti-cheat to make sure that they're not doing the specific things that the developers are checking for. And it's generally just a cat and mouse game, and we'll get into some examples in a minute, but the thing to be aware of is right now, the way a lot of developers are attacking the problems is by moving into what is called kernel mode anti-cheat. Now, I know there's been a bunch of, hype or drama about kernel mode anti-cheats, and I'm here to tell you right now, if a developer were to be pushing malicious code, like for tracking or whatever, it does not need to be done in the kernel. And this is one of those things that I kind of found ridiculous about this whole debate that goes on regarding, user mode and kernel mode. Kernel mode just means that the code is running at the operating system level. Yes, the code is going to have a higher privilege level than the user mode code, but for most situations, it is much simpler to just implement whatever code you're doing in user mode. And really the only purpose of a kernel mode anti-cheat is to try to detect kernel mode cheats. That's it. There's a couple other things that happen, like for example what Ricochet does, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Basically, kernel mode anti-cheats are not really much stronger than user mode anti-cheats. The only argument is that a kernel mode anti-cheat is only stronger than a user mode anti-cheat when we're dealing with kernel cheats, because kernel cheats can hide from user mode anti-cheats, whereas if you have a kernel anti-cheat, a kernel cheat cannot hide from it as easily. So, with all that being said, the reason Call of Duty is so easy to cheat on right now is because of a few reasons. First of all, the engine is the same every single year, right? As much as they say, yeah, we're using a new engine this year, everybody knows, no, they're not. When they're changing the engine, they're like changing the graphics rendering, right? Or they're upgrading certain components, but this has been the same. I'm here to tell you right now, I reversed the game. I'm telling you for a fact, this engine is the same engine that has been used since COD 4. There is nothing different in it. So what that means is that a reverse engineer attacking the game, or like a cheater, has a really easy time porting their cheats between games because the games are so similar. If I want to attack the modern Call of Duty, all I need to do is paste my project from the previous year, change a few things that match up with the new game's code, and boom, I've got a working cheat. That's why you've got people making cheats in the beta, in the alpha, because the engine does not change. And I'm not saying I expect the developers to change their engine every year. That's ridiculous. In fact, changing the engine at all is a ridiculous idea. You can't just change the engine of a video game. It doesn't work like that. Trying to do that, we're talking a ridiculous budget to do that, a ridiculous time deficit, and you'd basically be guaranteeing a loss in your next game. So there's no way that they would ever do that. But the problem is there's not enough protection against reverse engineering to stop cheaters from just pasting their code into the next game. Additionally, there are much bigger problems behind the scenes related to getting information about how the game works. So for anyone who's not aware, there are these things called PDBs. What this is a debugging file that gives you information to where your reverse engineering software can almost reconstruct the source of the game so that reverse engineering is way easier. What happens is these PDB files are internal to development, and cheaters will get contact with developers from the studio that are looking to make a little bit of extra money. And those cheaters, we're talking about people making like 10K a day off their cheats. So they got money set aside. So if they want to throw, 50 grand at a developer at the studio, they're like, hey, look, I'll hook you up with 50 grand. You hand me a PDB for the next Call of Duty. Boom, the deal's done. Nobody even knows it happened. And you've got these people with contacts inside of Activision, inside of Treyarch, inside of Infinity Ward, and they're buying these PDBs, and that gives them the ability to basically know every little change that has happened to the game since the previous game. And that's huge. It means making cheats is extremely easy. This happens at other studios too. You'd be surprised. Most of the major cheats out there that have like crazy capabilities, it's because they have access to this information. They've paid a developer to get them debugging information, or maybe an unprotected build, or all sorts of different things. And that gives them a leg up in terms of their cheat development. So all this to say, basically, the developers are not doing themselves any favors in terms of attacking cheaters. And Call of Duty's response to cheating has been really bad, in my opinion, because it seems like Activision is more oriented towards fixing the public relations issue than actually fixing the cheating problem. So, to talk about Ricochet, because Ricochet is quote unquote their next generation anti cheat solution, right? All Ricochet is, guys, I'm sorry to say it, their kernel driver is just there to stop other user mode programs from interacting with Call of Duty. That's it. It may delegate some of the old, user mode anti-cheat code into the kernel so that they have a little bit of an easier time dealing with it and cheaters have a harder time patching it. But for the majority, it's literally just stopping user mode programs from getting access to Call of Duty, which there have been ways to get around this for a decade at least. Cheaters have been dealing with this forever in things like Easy Any Cheat, BattleEye, you name it. And all it takes is Googling something called KD Mapper or something like that, and you basically already have bypassed the entirety of the new Ricochet anti-cheat in 5 seconds, right? And they've got all this like crazy bolstering going on, like, oh, we've got this in-game system where if we detect a cheater, their weapon's gonna get dropped on the ground, or you're gonna go invisible to them, or they're gonna do no damage to you. It's all ridiculous, like for show stuff. I think it's kind of funny, from a developer side. I do think it's a funny thing, but they're not improving their anti-cheat. They're just improving the way their anti-cheat looks to the end user, right? They want users to know when a cheater has been caught, because if you see a cheater being caught, you're less likely to be complaining about the other dozen cheaters you run into, because you figure, hey, they're going to get caught too. It's literally just this manipulative, predatory practice of, we can't deal with the cheaters, so we're just going to stop our losses financially and try to get people to stop saying that Call of Duty has a huge cheating problem. Now, granted, they have done some pretty smart things to deal with cheaters. Namely, the most important one is requiring a mobile number for account registration for, like, the next Modern Warfare, for example. That is huge. It makes it much harder to get a hold of throwaway accounts as a cheater, which means the cheats are harder to develop. And if your users get banned, it's a way bigger deal than it is for, like, free-to-play, for example. The second thing that they've done that's pretty smart, that's moving towards what I would like them to start doing, and what the anti-cheat industry in general needs to start moving towards, is they have started implementing something called server-side heuristics, which is where the server does some math to try to see if you are aiming weirdly, for example, right? It's basically them observing your behavior as a player and trying to determine if you're cheating, instead of just doing what most anti-cheats do right now and looking for the cheat. This is where we start talking about the specific implementation that Call of Duty has in terms of anti-cheat, what they do wrong, and what they should be doing. So first off, let's start talking about the way their current anti-cheat works. Now keep in mind, this is not an entirely encompassing description of the way the anti-cheat works, because, one, I don't know how every single thing in the anti-cheat works. To say I do is just a complete lie. The only people who do know exactly how the anti-cheat works are the developers or cheat developers who have basically full source to the anti-cheat. So basically the user mode anti-cheat does a few things. One, and this is the part that most people are aware of, is they will check your computer for any running processes that are known cheats. They generally will check things like the window names, they'll check the process name, they'll check like signatures, like if it's been signed by a certain company, they'll check for drivers that it loads, they'll check for handles, which are basically the process getting access to the game, and they'll basically just check for running processes. And it doesn't have to be cheats either. Like for example, if you open something like IDA, which is the reverse engineering software a lot of reverse engineers use, they'll know and they'll close the game or ban you. If you open the event viewer, they'll ban you. If you open basically anything that is a debugging tool, they'll ban you. So it's basically them looking to see if you're doing anything suspicious. And it's not really a great solution because there's a lot of ways for you as a developer to basically trick the game into having no information as to what's running on the computer. I'm not going to explain how to bypass this, but if you understand the basics of how processes work in Windows and how user mode programs can iterate them, you can hide your processes from that program very easily. So that right there does not work at all. The second thing that they do is they will check for any kind of debugger being run on the program. A debugger is basically just a program that makes it easier to kind of inspect the code of the game process and see what's going on in there. Again, anti-debug versus debugger has been going on for, a decade or two, and there's ways to bypass it and all sorts of different things, so that just does not work at all. Another thing they do is they check the loaded list of DLLs inside the process, and they require certain characteristics of the DLLs. Call of Duty doesn't really implement forced signing, I don't think, so I'm not going to really go into that, but they do check for any known cheat DLLs being loaded in the process. And the way they do this is it depends on the anti-cheat. From what I'm aware, they'll check things like text in the DLL that they know about. They'll check for certain like signatures of code inside the DLL. They'll put certain checks inside their code that basically see whether the DLL is calling game functions that it shouldn't. There's all sorts of stuff in there, but most of the time it's all the same stuff, right? They're looking for a cheat. They want to see if you have a cheat that they know about, that they've seen before on your computer, and if you do, that's it, you're done, right? They wait for you to cheat, and they wait to detect the cheat that you're using. And that is why their anti-cheat is so weak. It is so easy for a cheater to make their cheat look like it is a legitimate process or a legitimate DLL, and all they have to do is hide the right way from the anti-cheat, and boom, they're bypassing all of your security right then and there. Like, if that is the kind of security model that you want to have in your game, just expect it to never work, because it's a cat and mouse game. The developers are always going to be fighting against the hackers, and the hackers are always going to be one step ahead. One quick example I want to give you guys, because it's my own personal experience. When Cold War was first coming out, I was selling unlock all tools. For anyone who's not aware what that is, basically it lets you set your stats to the max and unlock all your camos and stuff without having to play the game for, dozens of hours. In my opinion, yeah, it's not right, whatever. It devalues what other people are doing, but I consider that on a completely different level than selling something like an aimbot. You guys can hate me for it, whatever, I don't care. But the point I'm trying to make is, the way I was doing this was with a GSC compiler. GSC is basically the internal scripting language for Call of Duty. And after a few months, I had made mistakes enough to where when my scripts were crashing, every time I was testing, those crashes were getting sent to Treyarch. And they eventually started looking into it and realizing, wait a minute, why is the game crashing in scripts that should not even be running right now? So they figured out that GSC was being injected, and they changed some stuff in the VM. They added obfuscation, which is basically protection to make the code harder to reverse. They changed some things inside of the VM to make it harder for me to reverse the GSC file format. Do you guys want to know how fast I was able to get around their new protection? 6 hours. It took me 6 hours from them changing the VM to have my compiler back up and running with the exact same capabilities that it did before. 6 hours. I think that's probably less time than it took the developers to implement the changes that they made. The point I'm trying to make is that the developers have to start actually attacking cheating at its source. They can't keep trying to make these half measures that deal with the current problem and just ignore cheating in general. Now, as a cheat developer and as a future anti-cheat developer, because I am working on my own anti-cheat and designing it, what I believe the industry needs to move towards is designing games to catch cheaters, not cheats. What this means is that instead of trying to detect suspicious things that the cheater is doing, you need to be detecting suspicious behavior, analyzing the way the player plays the game, analyzing what the player is doing, and determining when a player is cheating. Now, obviously, that's much easier said than done. But the way I want to describe this to non-developers is the following. When you're playing a game and there is a cheater in the lobby, almost everyone is immediately going to know. Why is a human able to determine this information, but a computer is not? It's really not that complicated. What has to happen is developers need to start analyzing why a player can notice that a cheater is cheating. For example, when a player has aimbot, how do we know? Well, as a human, it's very obvious. They're snapping their aim. They're making linear movements. The acceleration of their controls is wrong. It doesn't match their sensitivity. Their movements are very rigid. It's very obvious when they are having very high accuracy. They're aiming at very specific parts of the player's body within units of accuracy that are impossible for a human to reach. And that's just catching aimbot. When we're talking about ESP, there are certain psychological differences between a player who knows where all of the other enemy players are and a player who does not know where the other enemies are. There's certain playstyle differences, there's certain movement differences, both in the way that they move towards the enemies and in the way that they are looking at the game world. This list goes on and on. Let's talk about the hardware cheats like the Cronus, right? Because everyone's on about that and specific streamers using it, etc. You want to catch that? It's very simple. They are leveraging the in-game aim assist against you. If you understand the parameters that are being used to drive that, you can mathematically derive when a cheater is using it versus when a normal player is using it, especially when you start considering things like input frequencies, input accuracy. There's all sorts of different ways to be able to detect this stuff. Even when you add a layer of randomization, there are still significant statistical differences in the way that the inputs come out in a data set. Additionally, you can catch toggling by looking at statistical differences between certain characteristics that they're toggling. For example, their accuracy with aimbot and things like that. And guys, this is not just theory. This is actually being used in the real world already. If you guys have not been aware of the current cheating controversy in chess, one of the main things that is being done to catch cheaters in online chess is statistical analysis. Why can't we apply this to current generation first-person shooters? The answer, we can. And the studios are moving towards it. But they are not moving towards it with the amount of effort that is required to get ahead of the cheaters. Right now, the cheaters are winning, and I can say that with certainty. Call of Duty cheaters are winning. The anti-cheat developers are not trying hard enough. It does not seem like Activision or any of the studios have put enough effort into the anti-cheat to actually fight back. it seems like the majority of the effort in Activision has been towards getting the public to stop complaining about it, and that's it. When we look at how the game has been protected, one of the major things that is being pushed right now throughout the industry is binary protection. Binary protection is when the developers of the game use something called an obfuscator to abstract the code and change it in a way that makes it very hard to reverse engineer. A lot of the time, if this is done correctly, it can be done with almost a negligible performance impact, which means the only thing that it's doing is making it harder for cheat developers to reverse engineer the game and engineer their cheats. It also would directly attack the problems that Call of Duty has related to cheaters being able to just port their cheats over and over again because the engine is the same. If they used a adequate level of obfuscation, it would be much more difficult to interact with the game. In fact, this is already proven because the majority of cheaters who use certain functions to do, for example, unlock all or do certain things with their aimbot, but the majority of them quit whenever those functions get obfuscated. The current solution that Call of Duty uses is something called Argxan. It's been changed. It's like digital.ai now or something like that. Argxan on its own is a very powerful product. The problem is that the majority of implementations using Argxan are very weak. The developers use them sparingly. They do not use the obfuscator to its full capability, and a lot of the time their implementation is very easily bypassed. If the developers would take this more seriously and work on implementing their solutions to more directly attack cheating, this may actually produce a reduction in cheating overall. Combine that with reasonable heuristics and statistical analysis, and then add it on to the user mode, cheat detection where they try to detect cheaters. This could produce a really strong attack against cheaters, and it would make it much more difficult for anyone except for the most experienced cheaters in the franchise to have a foothold. And then that gives them the opportunity to spend less of their money just on countless lawsuits that have absolutely no effect on cheating, and they can spend that money on improving and maintaining their anti-cheat. Now, we're getting close to the 30-minute mark, which is kind of the hard cutoff, in my opinion, for these videos, so I'm going to try to wrap this up, but hopefully you guys have gotten a lot of perspective on the way the current cheating situation works. It's really down to the developers not implementing anti-cheat the way they should, and it seems like there's a lot of pressure from Activision to deal with the public relations side of things, but not a lot of pressure from Activision to deal with the actual cheating problem at its root cause. I'm sure it's probably cheaper to do it the way they're doing it right now, and I'm sure they think that their lawsuits are going to probably net them more in the long run. But the reality of the situation is, if they really want to address the cheating problem, the only way to do it is to start actually attacking cheaters. I'm absolutely sure that with enough time and effort, the developers of Call of Duty are more than capable of handling this problem, and a coordinated effort across the studio in each of the respective departments against cheating would probably be enough just to set back the cheaters long enough to make an impact on the game. I think that at the moment, it's really a bit embarrassing that even their brand new Call of Duty is still being attacked, even in the beta stages, and yet they still have the gall to put out these flexes of Ricochet and its quote-unquote power. They just released another article a couple days ago talking about the state of Ricochet and how good it is, and yet there's still cheaters everywhere in their games. Something as simple as engine owning, which has been around forever, still has pre-orders up for the next Call of Duty game, and I think that it is likely that engine owning is going to be up and running within a few hours of Modern Warfare 2 launching, and it seems like there is just all this talk from Activision about how good Ricochet is, and yet it's all bark and no bite. Anyways, guys, that's probably it for me for this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know in the comment section below. Let me know if there are any topics that you guys would like to hear me talk about, because I don't mind making these videos. It's not too much effort, obviously. We just record a little bit of ZBR and then I talk over the footage. So hope you guys enjoy the video, and I will see you in the next one.